Okay, according to the clock on the lower right-hand side of my computer, it is 2 o'clock, the top of the hour, here on the East Coast, so we are going to get started with today's webinar. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, The Gulf Oil Spill, Potential Health and Safety Hazards, an interactive webinar for all legal professionals involved with potential health and safety situations arising from the ongoing oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. During today's presentation, our presenter, Dr. Ken Weinberg, will cover the following: crude oil health hazards, disparate health hazards, sources of exposure, and how to reduce or prevent harm. Dr. Kenneth Weinberg, our presenter, served as the Director of Safety at Massachusetts General Hospital for more than 10 years. He is the former Administrator of Healthcare Specialty Practice of the American Society of Engineers. Dr. Weinberg is the author of 5 books and is currently a consultant specializing in environmental health, safety, and toxicology. He has served as an expert witness and/or an advisor in a variety of cases, including mold, latex injury, chemical exposure, hazardous materials exposure, and OSHA violations. There will be 2 question and answer sessions during the presentation. If you do have a question at any time, we do encourage you to use the chat or Q&A feature, which is found on the right-hand side of your screen, to submit your question. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with the link to the archived recording of this webinar, and we do ask that you take time to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after the webinar is over. That being said, I now invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to our distinguished presenter, Dr. Kenneth Weinberg. Dr. Weinberg, it's all yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be with you here this afternoon. As everyone is aware, the oil spill in the Gulf has been a tremendous hardship for the people down in the Gulf and has impacted workers and people who go there for vacation and has also, of course, had a big impact on the environment. What I want to try and do today is talk a little bit about what you may have already experienced if you're down there in the Gulf area and what you may experience in the future and what kind of health hazards people are experiencing. First of all, let's talk a little bit about crude oil. And forgive me if you already know this, but crude oil has been classified as either light or heavy, and it may also be called sweet or sour. Sweet crude oil means that it has a low sulfur content, and that's all relative, of course. And light crude oil means that the oil contains a number of volatile organic compounds in its composition. The other thing about light crude oil is that it's actually better to handle and easier to handle for those who are trying to process it through the pipelines as they're working with it to bring it to refineries. Some of the volatiles that you encounter in the crude oil are well known, and they include things like propane, hexane, butane, and other compounds that, for those of you who remember your chemistry, end in the suffix A and E. Now, crude oil in the Gulf is characterized as being light and sweet. The sweet means that the sulfur content is low. That really doesn't help a lot because the sulfur is an irritant. And for anyone who's ever lived or worked or even driven past a processing plant, you often will smell the sulfur in the air, even on that sweet crude. And again, the light means that it contains a lot of these organic compounds that can volatilize into the air. Now, when they're released into the air, the amount that's released is dependent on the water temperature, the turbulence of the water, and actually how deep the water is. So if the water is very turbulent, and I guess there's a storm, for example, churning up into the Gulf as we sit here and speak today, and if the water is a little bit warmer, then the volatile compounds are more easily released into the air. Also, the depth of the water plays a role in the release of the volatiles into the air, and the less depth there is in the water, obviously the more easily the compounds are released into the air as well. And among other things, these volatile compounds can be irritants at the very least. Now, the other potentially hazardous component of Gulf crude, which is found in all different kinds of oil products, are a group of chemicals called the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and these are long, straight-chain carbon atoms that have materials that come off of them, like the hydrogens and all. The important thing about this group of compounds is that they're rather ubiquitous in our environment in general, and they're a bit more complex than the volatile organics because they can undergo different reactions, as I'll show you in a minute. They're also less volatile than the other compounds and less soluble in water. But you may be more familiar, excuse me, with the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons as sort of a black tar that anyone who has a finished driveway may have. And in fact, there have been studies that have shown that there are higher concentrations of these petroleum hydrocarbons in people's homes who have their driveways sealed than there are in the atmosphere in general. And this is a big problem, and I'll show you why in a couple of seconds. Now, some of these PAHs, as they're called, can float on the surface of the water, but some of them can sink down in the water because they're so heavy and so complex and get into the sediment in the sea surfaces, in the lower surface of the water. Now, one of the problems is that these PAHs are fat soluble, so they can get into the fat stores of organisms, and they can stay there for a long period of time. Well, that's one of the problems, of course, with the fish and the seafood that lives in the water, because they eat all this material from the sediment or the things that are floating around in the water, and then they store these PAHs in their fat, and that this can be transferred up the food chain. So if you go out fishing in the water down there, and the fish have concentrated these fats in their organs, you may be partaking of some of those polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And we know, for example, that some crustaceans who also dwell down there, and we're talking about the shrimp and the crawfish and all that, are able to not only eat and store these materials, but they actually concentrate these materials, these toxins in their fat bodies to several times, in fact, orders of magnitude beyond what's just found floating in the water. If you went out and measured it, for example, you may find 10 parts per million in the water, but a crustacean could store up to 60 times that amount inside of their bodies. So if you eat that crustacean, you could be getting that material in your diet. The other thing about the PAHs is that they can attach to dust particles in the air, and they can be carried for several miles away from the source of the leak before they return to Earth. Now, how do we know this? Well, part of this we know from some previous oil spills, like the Exxon Valdez, and there was also a spill back in 2002 off the coast of Spain. and studies have been ongoing as a result of these particular studies and spills and so forth to find out what the fate of the polyaromatic hydrocarbons might be, not only in the short term but also in the long term. And as we know, these polyaromatic hydrocarbons can have a long-term life as they're contained in the tar balls that wash up onto the shore and cover over the rocks and the dirt and the sediment. And in Alaska, in Crude Bay, where the Valdez sunk, they were cleaning up from 1989 till about 2002. In 2002, the beaches appeared to be clean, but that was a visual observation, and in actual fact, there are tar balls that are still in the sediment under the soil, so it's a long-term kind of a problem. And the issue with the Exxon was that it was a single leak of a known quantity of oil, and so it sort of encapsulated. Here, with the Gulf oil spill, we have tremendous amounts of oil coming out of the well in the Gulf, and we really have no previous experience with this type of a continuous plume of oil, and what will the long-term effects of that oil be on the beaches and on the sea life. So we can only sort of extrapolate from that information. But the PAHs can form long-lasting toxic materials. Okay, now, I don't know, Matt, do we have any questions? I have a little note here.
Sorry, Dr. Weinberg, I was muted there for a second. We do have a couple questions. Mark asked, does the sulfur content of the crude affect its potential to harm people?
Well, in actual fact, sulfur causes irritation. So the higher the sulfur content, the more you may feel that scratchiness or irritation in your throat, and you may even get a headache from it. So yes, it does have the potential of causing more harm, and a lot of people are really very sensitive to the sulfur and the sulfur smell.
Okay, we have now a question from Andrew who asks, what are some harmful effects of PAHs?
Well, PAHs are known carcinogens, and interestingly, within the whole composition of PAHs, there are a lot of different chemicals, and they can be not only carcinogenic, but they can also be mutagens, which means that they'll change the DNA as you pass it on, potentially to your children or even your own DNA, or they can also be teratogens and cause birth defects. So PAHs are really very dangerous, and as time goes on, there really haven't been any long-term studies of how those effects may come upon you, but they actually seem to be capable of maintaining those characteristics and becoming even more harmful. In fact, one of the elements of PAH was part of the elements back in the 19th century that was discovered to be the cause of cancer in chimney workers in Europe at that time. So they've been known for a long time, and they are very dangerous.
Okay, a couple slides ago, and this is a question from Chris who asked, a couple slides ago, you talked about the crustaceans could be, affected by the oil. How long would it take from the time the oil started leaking out of the underwater well to get and to affect the crustaceans?
Well, actually, almost immediately, because the crustaceans are living there, and those materials are already getting into the soil and the sediment, and also floating in the sea, so that the crustaceans start eating right away. Now, to date, interestingly, some studies have been done on crustaceans and nothing's been found. However, and I'll show you later, the FDA has already put out warnings about the potential for harm to the crustacean and seafood population in the Gulf, and I've heard reports of some vendors refusing to purchase Gulf shrimp at this point in time because the harm can be almost immediate, but the concentration takes time. So if you've got some lucky shrimp that gets to swim around for an extended period of time, he's going to be more contaminated than the shrimp that are caught today, for example, or that were caught a month ago.
All right. Excellent. Good to know. We have a question here from Paul who asks, what tests are currently available and reliable as to determining levels of toxicity in humans?
Well, there really aren't a lot of tests that are available for humans. I mean, the only thing that really can be done, for example, is to go by what the complaints are that people are experiencing, because I don't think anybody's going to go in, for example, and start drawing blood or doing samples, but if people have complaints, and a lot of times the complaints will be very simple. They'll start out as being a headache or a rash. Then you can go through a series of tests to do liver disease, to study for liver composition or for toxicity in other organs in the body.
Dr. Weinberg, are you there with us?
I am. Somebody's trying to ring in on me, and I'm going by it.
Oh, that's okay. I don't see any other questions in the queue, so why don't we continue on with the presentation?
Okay, good. All right, move on to the next slide now. So when you have an injury, you have to ask yourself, what influences that injury? And this relates back to the last question we had in some ways. And first you have to determine what the nature of the hazard is. Is it a toxin or an irritant or a carcinogen? What kind of material you're looking at. For example, we know benzene is a carcinogen. And then you have to look at the exposure itself, because the mantra is always time and distance and the concentration of the material that you're exposed to. So how long are you being exposed? Is it momentary, or is it day in and day out at high concentration? Obviously, if you're out on the ships that are helping to clean up or put down the berms to collect the oil, it's going to be a long-term exposure. And then you have to look at what the concentrations of the chemicals are in the air. Even low concentrations of chemicals from the oil, for example, can cause headaches, rashes on the skin, sore throats. Longer exposures can cause more serious effects. And how are you exposed? Are you inhaling it? Are you eating it? And finally, are there other chemicals present in that mix? And when I say that, you may say, well, yeah, it's oil. But the reality is that crude oil has a lot of different chemicals and metals mixed in with it. So not only are there the petroleum hydrocarbons that we talked about and the volatile organics, but there could be heavy metals in there, for example, like lead or arsenic or cadmium that are also part of the exposure. Now, typically, the main way you're going to get exposed here is through inhalation. You're going to be breathing the air. Another way is ingestion. And as I show here, when you say ingestion, you say, well, you're not eating the stuff. But if you're out, working on the spill or working on cleanup on the shore, if you're exposed to this material, you could be accidentally ingesting it. What if you're smoking a cigarette, which you shouldn't be, but what if you are smoking a cigarette while you're working with it? Then you're actually going to get both ingestion and inhalation at the time that you're doing that. Or if you take a drink or eat something, you could be ingesting it as well. And then, of course, there's direct contact on the skin. And these oils, as many people know, are a significant irritant from the surface of the skin. And what organs can be affected? I guess the question I should ask is, what organs can't be affected? But you see this whole litany, nose, throat, skin, lungs, liver, kidneys, and even the heart can be affected by exposure to the oil. Now, breathing benzene at higher levels can cause dizziness, but a long-term exposure to even low levels of benzene is clearly linked to the formation of leukemia. So for people who live on the shore, and as this spill lingers on, and they're breathing the benzene odors for long periods of time, even in only the low part per million levels, around 20, 25 parts per million, they could start to develop illnesses that could eventually evolve into a leukemia. And toluene, which is also found mixed in the oil, can cause the same lightheadedness and dizziness. In fact, a lot of these hydrocarbons can cause these problems, but long-term exposure to toluene is related to kidney damage. So you can think of the effects of the exposure as being acute. What happens to you right now while you're working with it, and then long-term? The acute effects are, of course, the poor air quality, and that's the smell that we talked about from the sulfur, and the irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat, irritation and redness and swelling and rashes on exposed skin. There could be particulate matter in the air due to the burning of the oil. And remember that particulate can also contain the petroleum aromatic hydrocarbons attached to them. And these particulates can pose a real problem to people who already have existing health conditions, particularly respiratory conditions like asthma, and also people with existing heart conditions can be affected by an acute exposure to this material. The other thing you may see besides that are headaches and flu-like symptoms. So somebody could say, I'm having this sort of sneezing and my head is stuffed and I don't really feel well and I feel run down, and it could really be a symptom that's associated with an acute exposure to the oil. And the other thing we have to worry about, particularly amongst the people who are working to do the cleanup, is heat stroke because of the environment down in that area of the country. And one of the problems is that there are a lot of volunteers down there who may not really be used to the kinds of weather conditions and heat and humidity that one experiences down in the Gulf Coast. So they're good and prone for heat stroke. And of course, the way we handle that is a lot of periods of cooling and drinking a lot of fluids and wearing protective clothing. Okay, now, do we have more questions?
Yeah, this is the second question and answer break. So like the first one, if you do have a question, please use the chat or the question and answer feature, which is down on the right-hand side of the page to submit them. Dr. Weinberg, we do have a question here that came in from Scott who asked, can you give an example of a disperant?
Oh, yeah, the dispersants. One of the things that I'm actually going to mention, but one of the things that's interesting is that there may be a secondary problem with the oil spill in the Gulf, and that's the use of chemicals that are called dispersants. Now, they were first used, again, in the Exxon Valdez oil spill, but not to the extent that they're being used here. And the dispersant that's being most used is something called Corexit, and there's two forms of that, and that's C-O-R-E-X-I-T, and one of them is 9500, and the other one is 9527. The 9527 is a little bit more toxic than the 9500, and no one really knows what the long-term effects or the effects of exposure to high levels of this are going to be. But Congress and EPA have been asking a lot of questions about this because the Corexit contains a pesticide called 2-butoxyethanol, and it also contains lead and cadmium and arsenic and mercury, and it's classified as both a chronic and acute, or I should say it the other way around. They get some acute and chronic health hazards. And the dispersants actually mix up a combination of solvents and surfactants and additives to break up the spill and form it into little particulates. The problem is that the effects on humans and even on wildlife can be very significant.
Great. We have a question here from Paul, Dr. Weinberg, who asks, does mixing the chemicals, oil and dispersants, have a synergetic adverse effect on humans?
Well, that's
synergistic, I should say. Synergistic adverse effect on humans.
That's an interesting question because nobody's really studied that problem, but one can surmise that they may be, they're certainly going to be additive, and whether they're synergistic, and remember, synergy is more than the sum of the parts to the whole, is a question that really is still being looked at and studied, and that's one of the concerns that many toxicologists have at the present time.
Great. Dr. Weinberg, we do have a question here from Michelle who asks, what can government agencies and companies that are working on the spill do to help their employees that are also working on the spill mitigate the risk of suffering some of the health problems that you discussed in the previous slides?
Right. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but the big issues here come down to training and use of personal protective equipment, and the effort to try to minimize the amount of time for exposure. So there should be shifting of people in and out of the hot zones to help try and minimize their exposure.
Okay, I don't see any other questions right now in the queue, but if you do have a question for Dr. Weinberg, please feel free to use the chat or Q&A feature to submit it. Thank you. So let's continue on with the presentation.
Thank you. We have a couple more slides to go here. So the acute hazards, again, we talked about this, is the potential to affect the seafood supplies. And as I said, the FDA has already issued reminders to warnings to fishermen and to wholesalers about the concerns that they have, and that they actually have to certify their seafood that they take in and sell as being clean and free of any contaminants. The other thing that's a hazard that you may not think about, but it's the economy of the Gulf region is being really impacted, and the activities that people like to participate in the water, even if it's swimming or boating or fishing, is really going to be highly impacting, and people are really going to not want to be on the water, especially if the odor is there or they see big slips of oil coming in. So it's a big economic impact to begin with. Now, who are the people that are the most at risk? Well, cleanup workers are certainly at risk because they're into the area of the spill continuously. Children are always a hazard risk and a higher risk for exposures, and I'll show you why in a minute, to toxic material. Pregnant women are certainly more at risk for exposure to chemicals, especially if those chemicals can cross the placenta to get to the fetus. The elderly are also at risk, interestingly, for some of the same reasons as the children. And then the other group that I didn't put down here, but we really have to mention, are people who are already suffering from some kind of a chronic illness. And again, I mentioned the asthma before. And then the last group is the rest of us, who are also at risk. Now, why are children at higher risk? Because children consume more food and water and have a higher respiration rate per pound of body than adults. So if they're breathing faster and breathing in more air, you can imagine how they're getting a bigger dose of the toxic compounds in the air, and their bodies are much smaller, much less capable of dealing with it, and can be really heavily impacted than the rest of us. And again, I mentioned the fact that the toxicants may cross the placenta, and that can cause a problem. Now, we talked about the dispersants as well. They also, I won't go through this whole slide because we've already talked about this, but there is one last point down, the last one, which is interesting, that there's a toxicologist who also is a diver, and she put on a rubber wetsuit and went diving in the waters in the area of the Gulf. I don't know how close it was to the actual spill. It probably wasn't. And she reported feeling tingling in her body as she was diving down, and she interviewed some of the fishermen who were working in the area, and these fishermen were there to help do the cleanup. And she was talking about the Corexit that we just talked about, and she says that there's been evidence that this Corexit has caused heart palpitations and muscle spasms in the workers when they were acutely exposed. Now, the long-term effects of the exposure to oils is less studied, is less well studied, and some toxicologists believe that after some time the toxic materials will disperse and leave a person's body systems. But the question is that what damage will they have done in the meantime, and how long will that really take for excretion? Some of these products will be excreted in the urine, for example. Some will be exhaled. And again, the carcinogens and the PAHs that are found may have long-term effects, even if they do get excreted from the body over time. And again, the study that was done in Spain for the 2002 oil spill in Spain showed that there were changes in the DNA of people who were exposed to the oil spill. And the fear is that, like in secondhand smoke, the DNA changes may result in the development of cancer amongst those people who were exposed. And again, the other thing is that the people who live up in Alaska and were exposed to the Exxon Valdez sort of give us a longer telescopic look, because remember that happened back in 1989 on some of the potential effects. And of course, one of them, what we mentioned, is the exacerbation of pre-existing health conditions. So people who have asthma can get worse. There's the long-term environmental damage that occurs, which causes depression and economic hardship on the people who are affected and who live in that area. And there's just the overall sense of stress that people who live in the area where the Exxon Valdez was, that they feel that their lives have really been impacted. And I think Oh, yeah. The other thing is, we talk about how to protect yourself. Well, you have to wear personal protective equipment. You have to wear gloves, goggles, protective shoes, and respiratory protection. I know early on there was some conversation that some people, I think from BP, were saying that you shouldn't have to wear respiratory protection, and nothing could be further from the truth. The other thing is that when people are wearing, like the clothing, it's really difficult because it's so hot and humid down there, and you're going to really experience heat and stress from all of this equipment. But it also, so you have to worry about heat stroke and taking care of yourself and being hydrated. The other thing is that this protective equipment should be of the nature that doesn't allow any kind of water to get through to the surface of your skin, and that makes it even warmer inside of the protective equipment in the suit. The other thing is to wash regularly. Does that mean that you should go out and take a shower in the middle of the day? Well, that would be ideal, but certainly at least washing your hands whenever you take off the gloves and the goggles, and showering and cleaning as much as possible during the day. And again, I recognize that people out on the ships have more of a difficulty with doing that than people on land. The other thing is to wash the clothes that you're wearing regularly. And based on the experience that we've had with other kinds of toxic materials, I recommend that you keep those clothes separate from the other clothing in the rest of the house. Wash them in a separate, as a separate bin. Drinking the liquids, plenty of liquids to keep yourself hydrated. Don't touch the contaminated materials as much as possible. Keep away from them. If you do have to do any handling of, anything, then you should be wearing the thick rubber gloves. And whenever possible, you should get a baseline and then get regularly checked by medical professionals. And I say this because this is going to be a long-term kind of a process. It's not going to stop tomorrow. It's really going to go for a long, extended period of time. Even if the leak is completely stopped today, the exposure and the long-term contact with these materials is not going to stop. So you really want to have medical professionals looking at you, getting baseline numbers. And again, we go back to, I believe it was Michelle asked the question, excuse me, about what we can do to check people. And one of the things that can happen, for example, is looking at liver function, liver enzymes, and things like that. And there should be a regular checking of people to do that. And I think that concludes my formal portion of the presentation, but I'll certainly be happy to take more questions.
Great, and we do have a couple questions. We have a question from Tom who asks, how many days, weeks, months may it take to see symptoms in a patient that they have, they have suffered because of their exposure to these harmful chemicals?
Well, it could be tomorrow or it could be next week. Part of it depends on the level of exposure, right? And part of it depends on the health of the individual. So it's really hard to pin it down and say exactly when. But again, if a person is, let's say, an average, strong, healthy person who has no previous medical history, then it could take a little while. Although I think things like headaches and sore throats could probably start as soon as a few hours after the initial exposure.
Okay, great. And you, in your last slide, you talked about how to protect yourself, and your last point was to assure that you are regularly seen by trained medical professionals. We have a question here from Carol who asks, besides testing liver function and different enzymes in the liver, what other tests would you recommend that people working, on the Gulf oil spill should receive from trained medical professionals?
Well, interestingly, people who are going to wear respirators are going to have medical checking to make sure that they're still qualified to wear the respirator adequately. And there's a whole series of checks that go along with that. And people who are doing that should probably have some pulmonary function tests to go with it as well.
Okay, and then that should be part of the baseline, so they should have their pulmonary function tested as they work with the respirator and after they conclude working with the respirator. Is that correct?
Right. And people who are out there should be wearing respiratory protection, and if they're not, it becomes even more important to see a physician about their respiratory function.
Okay, great. We have a question here from Linda who asked, and this goes back a couple slides, I believe. Have there been any reported contaminated seafood products found to date?
The answer is that so far, as of about a month ago, there have been no contaminated seafood products that have been reported, but the search is ongoing. And as I indicated, there are reports coming from various wholesalers and distributors that are saying that even though they haven't been found yet, they're not purchasing any of the seafood products from the Gulf.
And we have another question here. Does proximity to the oil increase the chances of someone having an exposure-related illness? Otherwise, someone working, right at the foot of the well, or I should say at the surface of the well, versus someone who is cleaning up the beaches, does their proximity to the oil and possibly the dilution of the oil affect their chances of getting ill because of exposure?
Absolutely. Again, one of the mantras of toxic exposure is time and distance and concentration. So the longer they're exposed, the more harmful, the concentration of the material, the more harmful. And certainly one would expect that the concentration of the toxins in the oil would be higher right at the point where the well is leaking or on the surface of the water than it would be on shore. So certainly someone who's working right there on the water with it would certainly have the impact, feel the impact more greatly than someone on shore. On the other hand, someone who's going along with a scooper cleaning up the tar balls has a big potential for exposure as well, but not as much as that person out on the water. Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue. To all the attendees out there, if there are any questions for Dr. Weinberg, please submit them now using either the chat or the Q&A feature. I'll do a brief little conclusion, and hopefully that'll spur on some questions here, because I think the questions that have been asked so far have been great and have added to the presentation. I want to thank everybody, especially Dr. Weinberg, for putting this presentation together. We will be sending out the archived recording of this presentation tomorrow morning, along with the slides that Dr. Weinberg used. If you have a case or would like to talk to Dr. Weinberg about a potential case that you may be prosecuting in the future here or defending in the future, please let me know. You can send me an email at mhyde@tasanet.com, or you can call us at 800-523-2319, and I'm going to send that around to all the attendees right now. We will be having the third webinar in this three-part Gulf oil spill series on the 27th of July. It'll cover Dr. Ken Daugherty will talk about chemical dispersants, and we're very excited for that webinar as well. We do have our first webinar on business loss posted in the Knowledge Center of TASAnet.com. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to close the meeting down here in a couple minutes, but I will send around my contact information, and please look for an email from me
tomorrow morning with the archived recording and a copy of the PowerPoint slides that were used. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. We look forward to seeing you at future TASA events.